I'm going to end this with one space which I think is particularly interesting. And I'm going to do an analysis of what Courtney Kasdan in her celebrated book calls classroom discourse. So what's the classic pattern of classroom discourse, which is essentially an oral discourse, right? And it's a peculiar oral discourse. I mean, you know, there are genres and genres of oral discourse. The genre of classroom discourse is a genre kind of all of its own in all sorts of ways. So let me say what Courtney Kasdan's analysis of classroom discourse is. It's basically a repeated pattern of initiate, respond, evaluate. So here we go, initiate. Hey kids, a question. And they all shoot up their hands, right? And they'll say, okay, you answer. And one student gives an answer to the question, okay? And the teacher says, oh yes, that's right. That's right. Good girl. Good boy. Or if they're wrong, they say, oh no, that's wrong. Can somebody else answer it? Oh yes, that's right. Now, firstly, it's classic behaviorism, you know, which is, reward, a challenge followed by a reward. That's right, and you feel good about it. So it's classic kind of cycles of reinforcement in a behaviorist sense. Okay, fair enough. That kind of works sometimes, and that's the logic behind it. I'm just trying to analyze it rather than judge it. Now, okay, let me give you an example. I'm going to ask you a question, which is, what's the furthest planet in the solar system? Put up your hands. Well, the answer is Pluto, of course. That's right. Good. That's the answer. Okay? Now, there's a kind of discursive pattern assumed in this, which is I can really only practically have one answer. I'm looking for one correct answer. So the kind of discursive game that I'm playing, this oral language game, if you like, is to guess what's in the teacher's head. I'm trying to guess the answer because we don't have time for multiple answers. There's not a big discussion that's going to go on. And I say Pluto and the teacher says, yes, that's right. Okay. Now, meanwhile, one kid becomes a proxy for the rest of the class. In other words, on behalf of the rest of the class, one kid answers and the other kids listen to that answer and they listen to the teacher's response. And the theory is by listening to the answer and the response, the kids learn. Sometimes this is called kind of Socratic dialogue, if you want to be generous as a kind of discourse. So it's a classic discursive pattern where two of the people in this group, this room with 30 human beings in it, are talking at any one time and the others are listening. Now, what I want to do is I want to contrast this with using a discussion board to hold a classroom discussion. And I want to contrast this with a social media activity stream as a form of discussion. So remember I was saying there are these hybrid spaces which are neither here nor there. And what I want to really focus on is I want to focus on how this kind of discussion is actually incredibly different to oral language. You're in writing and it has all the forms of conversation. It might be slightly badly typed and badly formed, but it's writing in some very interesting ways. And if we have this analysis, the difference between writing and speaking, one of these discussion boards or a social media feed is incredibly different to speaking, and in these following ways. So I'm going to go back to the classroom, and here we have a classroom discussion where the students are discussing a prompt put up by the teacher about Rosa Parks and the whole civil rights movement in the United States. So the post's there and the students are talking about that. So here are the differences between classical classroom discussion and this classroom discussion. Firstly, everyone responds. Now, that's actually a big difference. In a classical conversation, one person talks at a time, turn taking, and not everybody can talk at once. Really only two people can be involved in the conversation only, or if there's more than two people, only one person can speak at a time. Everybody responds and everybody responds at the same time. Now, what does this mean in a classroom? Actually, it makes a huge difference in the classroom. And the huge difference is related to the characteristic nature of writing at a distance, recording something that can be read later, the atemporality of writing, which doesn't exist in speech. You can track it back to that. So everybody's all writing all together, and then they press post, and then it all comes up, and there's a whole pile of stuff coming through. So everybody's responding, everybody's talking all at once, and that is manageable in a way that is not manageable in normal speech. And it's manageable because, look, I'll read it as it comes up, and I'll read it when I can read it, which is a few seconds later, and I'll read it as an activity stream, and I can read it all, and I can read faster than I can listen to speaking. So it's a very, very, very different discursive experience. The second thing is there are lowered barriers to response. So my sort of flippant, facetious, badly behaved theory of the person who puts up their hand. I want to answer the question. And the teacher says, oh yeah, what's the answer? It's always the wrong person. Because the teacher asks them because they think they're going to have the right answer, because they need to be a proxy for the rest of the class. And they're someone who's arrogant enough to think they can ask the first question and be dominant and all that kind of stuff. So my sort of facetious little theory is it's always the wrong person who answers, always the wrong person. Whereas here, when everyone responds, the teacher can say, everyone has to write a response, right? It lowers the barriers to response. And by the way, as the other people's responses are coming through, if you're a little bit nervous and a little bit slow, other people's responses give you an idea and give you a bit of confidence and, they've answered, I can answer too, right? So this becomes, lowers the barriers to, so it's conversation and it's profoundly different in these ways. The other thing that's really, really interesting is classic classroom discourse is what I say is that it reinforces an architecture of sameness, which is that answer, we can't have too many answers because it'll take forever because they can only happen one after each other in time. So what it does is it prompts giving the same right answer. The assumption is when everybody else hears the answer in the classroom, that they would have, had they been asked and they knew to give the right answer, would have given the same answer. But in fact, what's interesting is when I ask that question, what's the last planet in the solar system, and someone says Pluto, someone's going to say, oh, but there are these other little planets, and oh, maybe Pluto isn't a planet. Nothing in the world is straightforward. There isn't a single answer to most things in the world. You know, 1 and 1's 2, that's a straight answer. But when we're dealing with language and meaning, even things in the world which seem straightforward, there can always be nuances of difference. And when everyone responds, the way in which they frame things is different, the answers in which they give are different. So whereas classic classroom discussion reinforces an architecture of sameness, what we have with these kind of activity feeds is immediately voices, the differences between voices, experiences and interests and knowledge and personas, those things become visible. And the minute they become visible, we start talking to each other. Oh, I don't agree with that about Pluto because there's this other thing. Oh, yes, you might be right. People start talking to each other around the nuances. So the discussion becomes, instead of this backwards and forwards process, it becomes this multipolar, complex process in the classroom. But the next thing about it is that in terms of the amount of meaning floating past you, the amount of text floating past you, it's highly engaging. The truth is, for the 29 of the 30 kids who are just listening to the answer, it's a pretty boring experience. Your brain goes slower than spoken speech, and you're hearing somebody answer. It's pretty damn boring, to be quite frank. Whereas when you've got 30 answers all of a sudden coming up in the activity stream and you've got to speed read them, it has the kind of cognitive intensity that actually social media does. You know, look, we managed to cope with our Facebook feeds and our Twitter feeds, which have huge amounts of stuff more than we can deal with, and we scan through it. But it has a kind of cognitive intensity and engagement which are different. So, you know, people say, oh, cognitive load, don't overload the kids because, you know, they won't be able to think, blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm not so much worried about cognitive load with young people. I'm worried about cognitive underload, not overload, underload, which is, and classical classroom discourse is probably, most of the time, cognitive underload. So, the next thing is that what we're engaging students in is a process of reading and writing. So it's a highly participatory process where you read something which is a prompt, you write, you read other people's comments, you write. So it's a highly dialogical thing where you mix reading and writing in a kind of an even kind of way. One of the funny things that we used to do in literacy pedagogy is we had reading. I'm going to read, and comprehension, did I get it? And I had writing, I'm going to write an essay. But this deeply connected space of reading and writing, this is a new phenomenon, which is actually reading and writing, and it's deeply interleaved, and it's very different from, as I've just said, the world of classroom oral conversation. But the next thing about this, which makes it profoundly different, is that characteristically with oral language, we are confined in time and space. So we've got to be within earshot of each other, preferably in the same room. We're confined in time, which is we've got to be here at the same time for it to work. We've got to be in the same time zone. But what we've done here with this kind of activity stream is we've shifted discourse, which is patterns of conversation, patterns of dialogue, patterns of interactive thinking. By moving it to reading and writing, we've shifted it outside time and space. So it doesn't matter if it happens live in the classroom while the kids are writing their answers and perhaps talking as well orally on top of it, or whether the same discussion happens overnight, because discursively it's the same thing. It doesn't matter whether they're at home or in the classroom, whether it's in the cell of the timetable or any other time like at home. So what happens is we take this classical mode of classroom discourse and we make it ubiquitous. We take it out of the confinements of time and space. That's another huge shift. So the other thing too is that classically, in classical classroom discourse, it's the teacher that's the initiator, because the teacher knows they want the answer from the student. But in fact, in this kind of environment, anyone could be an initiator. They can start a conversation. So the idea that the teacher dominates doesn't have to be there as well. But the other point that I'd like to make about this as well is just simply a technical point. That what happens is you've got a few moments to think before you press the comment button, right? You've got a few moments to think. And in a way, what it does is cognitively, it takes you into a space of writing, because I type up what I've done, I go back and look over it, I fix a few typos, I remove a word that's repeated. It only takes me a few seconds to do this. I put a full stop on the end, I put a capital letter at the front perhaps, maybe 2 sentences. And in fact, what I've done is I've taken my speaking, or what would have been speaking in the vernacular, and I have put it into an intermediate form of writing, which is grammatically somewhere between speaking and writing. It might speak subjectively, it might have I in it as a word, it mightn't be so objective, it might be all those things which are characteristics of archetypical writing. That in fact what I've done is I've taken a step between the world of vernacular oral language and the world of academic literacy, the world of formal writing. What I'm arguing is that formal writing, and in the next section of these videos, I'll argue it at length, that formal writing actually has powerful cognitive structures in it which are different from the cognitive structures of everyday life and the cognitive structures of orality. Now, the very last thing I want to say about this medium is that what we could do is we can data mine this stuff in a way that it's hard to data mine orality. So at the end of the lesson, the kids remember a bit of stuff. It's ephemeral. Everything that happens in orality just floats off into the air, and you recall things in a rough kind of way. The teacher might remember, oh, that kid was good today and did a lot of response, and they might be very aware of the other kids, and they might have a sense they didn't respond or whatever. But we can do learning analytics on these discussion boards, on these discussion forums, on these activity streams. We can see, we can do network analysis of who's talking with who. This person's an outlier. There's a little group of people there talking to themselves over here. We can do these kind of visualizations of network analyses. We can just look at how many words they wrote. We can do academic language analyses of, what's the academic language level in terms of vocab and syntax that the kids are putting in this, whatever. We can check that everybody responded. We can check levels of engagement. In fact, we're able, because this data is all captured and recorded in the nature of writing, by the way, not in the nature of the digital stuff per se, but in the nature of writing as a medium for recording meanings, that we can then do all these analyses which give feedback to the teacher, which say, oh, look, that kid is not contributing, or that kid's language level is this, or I'm a bit worried about this clique because my network analysis says this. So it can give the teacher a whole pile of information which is really valuable to their analysis of what's happening in the classroom. Now, all they had before was the teacher asks the question, that kid gets it right, that kid gets it wrong. We don't ask the rest of the kids and we know that kid got it wrong, but we don't even have a record of that. And in fact, the feedback mechanisms for the teacher in classical oral classroom discourse are quite limited. We can have much more elaborate feedback mechanisms. So if you think I'm saying these kind of new media environments are a better place to hold classroom discussions, you're probably right, actually. Now, it's not to say we shouldn't have classroom discussions and orality goes away. One of the very interesting things in our research is that we can be in a classroom where this kid is talking to this kid, then that kid, because they're all over the room. It's a pretty quiet room, and every now and then they talk to each other as well. So in other words, it's not to say that orality doesn't exist and it's not layered in, but we've built this complex, multimodal, synesthetic space where the dialogue is going on in reading and writing as well as listening and speaking all at once.